Hey there, welcome to Night Lectures, your daily dose of fascinating stories. What if the most mysterious myth in history was not a fiction at all? Where was Atlantis? Was it a real civilization that disappeared in a single night, or just a philosophical parable? In this video, you will learn what exactly Plato said about Atlantis, what its city, army, and wealth were like, how the war with Athens began, and what led to the fall of that civilization. We will also explore why it was forgotten for 1,000 years, how people began to search for it, from Bimini to Antarctica, and why Atlantis still remains an enigma that haunts the world. Share your ideas for future videos in the comments and hit the subscribe button. New bedtime stories come out here daily. The story of Atlantis begins not in archaeological excavations and not in ancient oral myths, but in a written text, created at a specific time by a specific person, the Athenian philosopher Plato. Before him, in none of the sources that have come down to us, be they Sumerian cuneiform tablets, Egyptian inscriptions, or Greek legends, does the name Atlantis appear. Everything we know today about it comes from two of Plato's dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. To understand how the story was born, we must look at the life of Plato himself, his aims, and the world in which he grew up and formed as a thinker. Plato was born in 427 years before Christ in Athens, a city that at the time was living through hard days. His family belonged to the old aristocracy and held influence in political circles. Among his relatives were Charmides and Critias, members of the oligarchic regime of the 30 tyrants who came to power in Athens after its defeat in the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War was a catastrophe for Athens. Its defeat meant the loss of political power, the decline of the economy, internal strife, epidemics, and moral collapse. All this unfolded before young Plato's eyes. He saw how the old order crumbled, how one regime replaced another, democratic, then oligarchic, then democratic again, yet each time society plunged deeper into chaos instead of justice and harmony. In his youth, Plato became a disciple of Socrates, the man who had the greatest influence on him. Socrates wrote no treatises and created no systems, but his method of dialogue and his relentless questioning left a profound mark. Plato watched how his teacher challenged the foundations of Athenian democracy, accused his fellow citizens of moral blindness, and called them to self-knowledge. It all ended tragically. Socrates was tried, convicted of corrupting the youth and impiety, and executed. The death of Socrates was a shock to Plato. He lost faith in democracy and concluded that a just society was impossible unless its citizens possessed philosophical knowledge and rulers were guided by reason rather than passion and greed. This conviction became the foundation of all his works. Around 387 years before Christ, Plato founded the Academy, the first philosophical school in history, where students studied mathematics, astronomy, music, logic, ethics, and politics. There he wrote his principal works, including the Republic, an attempt to describe the ideal state. It was within these same reflections that the dialogues Timaeus and Critias appeared, in which the story of Atlantis first emerges. Timaeus was written around 360 years before Christ. At first glance, it deals with the structure of the universe, the origin of the soul, the movement of the stars, and the harmony of the cosmos. Yet at its opening, almost as a preface, appears a mysterious story about an ancient conflict between Athens and Atlantis, a mighty power located beyond the Pillars of Heracles, that is, beyond the Mediterranean Sea. Plato does not tell the story as his own invention. He traces a chain of transmission. His great-grandfather Critias the Younger heard it from his grandfather Critias the Elder, who in turn heard it as a child from Solon, the great Athenian lawgiver who had lived 2 centuries earlier. Solon, in turn, had heard it from Egyptian priests in the city of Sais during his travels. Plato recounts a dialogue in which an Egyptian priest addresses Solon with the famous words, "O Solon, Solon, you Greeks are always children." The priest reproached the Greeks for not preserving the memory of ancient history because their cities had been destroyed many times by wars and disasters, whereas the Egyptians had kept written chronicles for thousands of years. According to the priest, these chronicles mentioned an event that had taken place 9,000 years before Solon's time. Then there had existed a vast realm, Atlantis, possessing enormous military and economic might. Atlantis sought to subdue the entire known world, including Athens. Yet the Athenians, though modest in resources, resisted and preserved their freedom. Soon after, Atlantis perished. In one day and one night it was swallowed by earthquakes and floods, vanishing into the depths of the ocean. It is important to note that Plato presents this not as a myth, but as a supposedly historical account, passed down through generations. Still, it remains unclear whether he himself believed the story's truth or used it as an allegory. The context of Timaeus suggests that Plato was not primarily concerned with history, but used the tale of Atlantis as an introduction to his reflections on cosmic harmony and the ideal state. Yet he did everything to make the account sound plausible, naming participants, describing the setting, and specifying how Solon had learned of it. After Timaeus, Plato began work on Critias, meant to describe Atlantis in detail, its political system, architecture, customs, and way of life. But the text breaks off mid-sentence. Whether Plato died before finishing it or left it unfinished intentionally is unknown. He also planned a third dialogue, Hermocrates, to complete the trilogy, but it was never written or has been lost. Plato's contemporaries and later philosophers treated the story skeptically. Aristotle bluntly declared that Plato had invented Atlantis to illustrate the consequences of moral decay, pride, and the abandonment of virtue. Yet over time, the line between philosophical parable and the search for a lost civilization began to blur. The key thing to understand is that Atlantis does not come from folk tales or ancient myths. It appears in a precise historical moment, in a text written by a specific author. It was part of Plato's meditation on how fragile civilizations become when they are built not on reason and virtue but on greed, arrogance, and the lust for power. When Plato turns in Critias to describing Atlantis, he begins not with moral or political reflection, but with geography, resources, and appearance. According to him, Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, separating the Mediterranean from the Atlantic Ocean. The island was immense, larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, and stood amid the boundless ocean that the Greeks called simply the Outer Sea. Its natural wealth was astonishing. Atlantis had fertile plains, broad valleys, and mountains thick with forests that provided timber for ships and houses. Rivers ran down from the highlands, feeding lakes and canals. Hot springs offered both cold and warm water for homes, gardens, and baths. The island teemed with animals of all kinds, herds of cattle, goats, and sheep, and, as Plato stresses, elephants that found ample food and space there. The soil yielded rich harvests of grains, fruits, and vegetables. Vineyards, olive groves, and orchards flourished. Among them grew strange fruits unknown to the Greeks. The land also produced rare herbs used in medicine, crafts, and perfumes. At the island's heart stood its magnificent city, built around a hill where, according to legend, the god Poseidon had once met and loved a mortal woman named Cleito. To protect her, he encircled the hill with 3 rings of water and 2 of land, alternating belts connected by bridges. These rings had precise dimensions. The innermost canal 3 stadia wide, then a land belt of the same width, then another canal 2 stadia wide, again a land ring, and finally the outermost canal 3 stadia wide, linked to the sea by a dug channel. The city's infrastructure was marvelously planned. All canals were connected to one another and to the sea, allowing ships to sail directly into the harbor and unload at the city walls. Along the banks stood docks, warehouses, and shipyards. Bridges rose over the channels, while gates and towers guarded the entrance to the central district. The walls were built of 3 kinds of stone, white, black, and red, quarried on the island itself. They were covered with metal sheathing, the inner wall with orichalcum, the middle with tin, and the outer with copper, which made the city gleam brilliantly in sunlight. At the center stood a vast temple of Poseidon and Cleito, faced with silver outside and orichalcum within. Inside was a colossal statue of Poseidon on a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses, surrounded by statues of his 10 sons, each ruling one of Atlantis's 10 regions. Next to the temple rose the royal palace, a complex of halls, rooms, gardens, and terraces. Floors were inlaid with mosaics of ivory, gems, and gold. Walls were clad in orichalcum and bronze, and roofs shone with tin. The inner courtyards were filled with exotic plants, pools of fresh and salt water, fountains, and shaded walks. Atlantis's economy rested on advanced agriculture, mining, crafts, and international trade. The central plain around the city was a vast rectangle, about 540 kilometers long and 360 wide, divided into plots crossed by parallel canals 100 feet wide and spaced 300 feet apart, with transverse canals for drainage, irrigation, and transport. Each region had its own military and economic specialization. Plato even specifies how many chariots, infantrymen, archers, and ships each district had to supply in wartime. Administration was strict and orderly, based on ancient laws given by Atlas and his brothers. Politically, Atlantis was a confederation of 10 kingdoms, each ruled by a descendant of Poseidon. Supreme authority belonged to the eldest king in the capital, but the others retained autonomy. Important decisions were made by a council that met at Poseidon's temple. Before each session, the kings performed a sacred ritual. They hunted a bull without weapons, sacrificed it, washed their hands in its blood, and swore an oath to uphold justice and preserve harmony. For a long time, Atlantis flourished. Its people obeyed the laws, honored the gods, and lived morally. Wealth did not corrupt them, luxury did not blind them, and power did not turn to tyranny. As long as the divine part in their souls remained strong, their society stayed balanced and stable. But as generations passed, that divine nature began to fade. Greed, pride, and the thirst for domination replaced virtue. Palaces grew ever more lavish, festivals ever more ostentatious, armies ever more aggressive, and rulers less inclined to keep their oaths or care for their subjects. At that point, Plato says, decline began. The great realm, once in harmony with gods and nature, drifted from the laws of its ancestors. Instead of seeking justice, the Atlanteans sought conquest and riches. Here Plato's description ends. The rest of his account turns to what this moral decay led to: Atlantis' attempt to rule the world, its war with free Athens, and its ultimate fall. When Plato continues his story in Critias, he begins with the moment when the mighty island, intoxicated by power, turned its ambitions toward world domination, seeking to subdue every land on both sides of the Pillars of Heracles. According to the Egyptian priests, Atlantis, having already conquered many islands and coastal territories, extended its control over Libya as far as Egypt and over Europe to the borders of Tyrrhenia. These peoples paid tribute, sending soldiers, ships, livestock, metals, and whatever Atlantis demanded to sustain its might. Its drive for conquest no longer came from necessity, but from moral corruption. When the divine element in their souls weakened, greed and the lust for power took over. Then the Atlantean rulers resolved to subjugate Athens, a city that, according to the priests, was in those ancient times very different from the Athens of Plato's day. Those early Athenians lived not by luxury or force, but by virtue, justice, and the laws given by the goddess Athena. They worked, worshipped the gods, and valued harmony more than wealth. Their city was an ideal polis ruled by reason, law, and mutual respect. When the Atlantean kings sent envoys demanding submission and tribute, the Athenians' reply was clear. They would never yield their freedom. They began to prepare for war. Atlantis mobilized its vast forces, thousands of chariots, tens of thousands of infantry, legions of cavalry, and a mighty fleet capable of transporting armies across the sea and blockading coasts. Shipyards hammered day and night, weapons were forged, ships built, provisions stored. The Athenians, though far fewer, armed every able man. The city strengthened its walls, erected new fortifications, and stocked food for a siege. Above all, they relied on unity, courage, and divine favor. The war began at sea. The Atlantean navy tried to blockade Attica, cutting Athens off from supplies, then to land troops for an assault. But the Athenians built swift, maneuverable vessels better suited to coastal combat. The sea battles were fierce and prolonged. Athenians struck by night, ambushed in coves, and used their knowledge of local waters to deadly effect. Despite their numbers, the Atlanteans failed to gain control of the sea. After repeated defeats, they turned to a land invasion. Their army landed on the coast of Attica and advanced toward the city. But the Athenians, using the terrain to their advantage, fortified the passes and set traps along the roads. The fighting on land lasted not days but months. The Athenians fought flexibly, counterattacking, ambushing, destroying supplies, and cutting communications. The Atlanteans, unaccustomed to such resistance, grew weary. Their chariots bogged down in mountain passes. Their troops suffered heavy losses. The campaign reached its climax when the Athenians, feigning retreat, lured the main Atlantean forces into a narrow valley where ambushes awaited. Arrows and stones rained from 3 sides. The enemy, trapped and unable to deploy their heavy troops, was annihilated. At the same time, the Athenian fleet struck the enemy ships anchored nearby, burning and sinking them. The remnants of the Atlantean army, cut off and demoralized, fled in disorder. It was a total victory. The Athenians had not only defended their land, but proved that virtue, unity, and justice can overcome sheer power. They did not pursue the defeated, nor seek conquest. They had fought only to protect what they valued most, their freedom and their laws. Thus ended the War of Athens and Atlantis, a great battle between a civilization founded on justice and one corrupted by greed and pride. Yet the story of Atlantis did not end there. Humbled and weakened, it soon faced a far greater enemy, the forces of nature, against which neither armies nor riches could prevail. When Plato in the dialogue Critias reaches the climax of his tale, he describes the moment when the gods, watching Atlantis, could no longer remain indifferent to how a people who had once lived by their precepts had finally lost virtue and surrendered to greed, arrogance, and the drive for boundless power. The island that had once embodied harmony, order, and justice ceased to follow the laws Poseidon had established for his descendants, and thus violated the fundamental order the gods had set in the world. Zeus, ruler of Olympus, gathered all the immortals in his hall to decide what punishment should befall Atlantis for its pride, for abandoning piety, betraying justice, and placing its own might above the will of the gods. Plato describes the scene in detail, how Zeus addresses the other gods, how he rises above them, looking down upon the earth, and begins to speak. But his speech we never hear. The dialogue breaks off at that very moment. Nevertheless, the end of the story is clear. Plato states unambiguously that soon after these events, Atlantis vanished. The catastrophe was sudden and devastating. In one day and one night, the island was swallowed by monstrous earthquakes and enormous waves. The earth split. The ground yawned open. Torrents of water swept away cities, temples, palaces, and every fortification. Everything generations had built, canals, quays, gardens, temples, markets, and residential quarters, disappeared as if it had never existed. The island sank. Where the temples of Poseidon had recently stood, where royal palaces had towered and bustling ports had roared, there remained only a blank, level sea. Plato specifies that in the place of Atlantis shoals and muddy shallows formed, which for a long time hindered navigation. Sailing through those waters became dangerous. Submerged ruins, sandbanks, and silty deposits made the sea impassable for ships. The destruction of Atlantis, as the Egyptian priests in Plato's account emphasize, was neither an accident nor a whim of nature, nor the result of a random natural disaster. It was the direct consequence of the moral fall of its inhabitants. The gods cared nothing for how rich the temples were, how mighty the armies had become, or how extensive the trade networks were. The only thing that mattered was the preservation of an order grounded in harmony between humankind and the cosmos, in reverence for laws and gods, in virtue and justice. When that order was broken, when the Atlanteans rejected the commandments of their ancestors and replaced them with the pursuit of power and wealth, retribution became inevitable. First, Atlantis lost its war with Athens, which, according to Plato, at that time was the very model of justice and moral order. And soon after came the blow from nature itself, governed by the will of the gods. Yet the very moment of the catastrophe, for all its significance, remains almost undescribed in Plato's dialogues. He reports only the result, the island's demise, but not the process itself. He does not tell how walls collapsed, how palaces were flooded, how people fled, how canals were torn apart, how ships broke from their anchors and went down into the depths together with the cities. Plato left no image of the storm, no description of the waves, no picture of the earth breaking open. All we know is the outcome. Atlantis was gone. Why does the narrative break off? There is no answer. Perhaps Plato deliberately left the story unfinished so that everyone who heard it would ponder for himself the causes, the consequences, the meaning of the destruction. Perhaps he wished to stress that the essence lay not in the details of the ruin, but in its inevitability as the consequence of lost virtue. Or perhaps the reason was more prosaic. The text was simply never completed, or its ending was lost. It is known that Plato planned a third part of the trilogy, a dialogue called Hermocrates, which was to complete the cycle begun in Timaeus and continued in Critias. We can only guess at its contents, but most scholars incline to the view that it was to describe either the aftermath of Atlantis' fall or to draw the philosophical conclusion to the entire story, showing how the lessons of this catastrophe were to be received by future generations. In any case, the destruction of Atlantis, as Plato portrays it, is not merely a tale about the ruin of a single island. It is a story about how even the mightiest civilizations, those with immeasurable wealth, powerful armies, great cities, and astonishing technical achievements, remain vulnerable if they lose their inner foundation: virtue, justice, and respect for the divine order. Atlantis disappeared. It ceased to exist both physically and within the history of its time. Yet the memory of it did not vanish entirely. That memory continued to live, in stories, in rare records, in the echoes of myth. For many centuries, however, its story would almost fade from human consciousness. What became of the legend next? That is the subject of the following chapter. After Plato told the world the story of Atlantis, the fate of this legend for many centuries was near oblivion. The very next generations of ancient thinkers viewed it more as a philosophical parable than as a real account of the past. Even Aristotle, Plato's pupil, maintained that his teacher had invented Atlantis for didactic ends, to illustrate his own ideas about laws, morality, and the structure of the ideal state. In the centuries that followed, virtually none of the major historians, neither Herodotus, nor Polybius, nor Strabo, nor Pliny the Elder, showed interest in the tale. It hardly appeared in geographical treatises, historical chronicles, or philosophical works. The reception of Atlantis gradually narrowed to seeing it merely as a figurative example meant to show what follows from the loss of virtue and the rejection of divine law. In late antiquity, when Neoplatonism replaced classical philosophy, the name of Atlantis surfaced now and then, but only as allegory. Philosophers, discussing the order of the cosmos, the immortality of the soul, or the laws of the world order, might mention it, not as a real place, but as a symbol of the fall and destruction that awaits any civilization that loses its bond with the divine order. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed and the Middle Ages began, interest in ancient philosophical traditions nearly disappeared. In Europe, there began an era in which questions of morality, theology, and the salvation of the soul outweighed any reflections on the past, on geography, or on the nature of the world. Plato's dialogues endured. They were copied in monasteries, preserved in the libraries of Constantinople, studied in the Muslim world. But the story of Atlantis within those texts remained something secondary, almost invisible beside his other ideas. Medieval thinkers did not explicitly deny the existence of Atlantis. They rather showed no interest in it. Its place was taken by biblical narratives, stories of Sodom and Gomorrah, of the flood, and of the Tower of Babel. If Atlantis was recalled at all, it was most often in the context of general reflections about how God punishes proud nations. Sometimes it was mentioned in commentaries on Plato, in rare encyclopedias, or in the treatises of Byzantine authors, but such references were always brief and devoid of independent significance. Even medieval cartographers, as they sketched a world filled with wonders and unknown lands, almost never included Atlantis on their maps. Their imagination conjured isles of the blessed, Eden, islands of saints, or places where, according to legend, Christian relics were hidden. But the idea of a sunken continent beyond the ocean did not become part of medieval imagination. And yet, the legend did not disappear. It continued to exist in copied manuscripts of Plato's dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. It was preserved in the writings of Arab scholars, in the libraries of Constantinople, in the works of the few Byzantine philosophers and theologians who maintained an interest in classical heritage. Atlantis did not sound loudly, but its name did not vanish entirely from cultural memory. It was precisely this quiet persistence that allowed the legend to survive the Middle Ages. And when Europe once again turned its attention to the legacy of antiquity, when the Renaissance and the great geographical discoveries began, the name of Atlantis resurfaced. New hypotheses lay ahead, attempts to find its traces in the oceans, ideas that it might be connected with the New World or with lost islands. With the end of the Middle Ages and the dawn of the Renaissance, Europe's interest in the classical heritage revived rapidly. Scholars again turned to Plato's works, including those dialogues in which the story of Atlantis first appears. What for centuries had been regarded as a merely philosophical parable once more became the subject of serious consideration, not only among philosophers but also among geographers, travelers, sailors, and cartographers. In this period, Europe ventured beyond its familiar bounds. Portuguese and Spanish ships passed through the Pillars of Heracles, sailed into the Atlantic Ocean, and found new islands and lands that ancient geographers had never imagined. The appearance on maps of the Azores, the Canaries, Madeira, and many other territories prompted a question. Might these lands be the remnants of the once vast island described by Plato? At this time, a notion gradually took shape that the tale of Atlantis was not just a philosophical allegory, but possibly a memory of a real, sunken civilization. The first candidate for its trace became the Azores. Their location, at the very center of the Atlantic Ocean, far beyond the Pillars of Heracles, matches Plato's description. Moreover, the mountainous nature of the archipelago suggested that these might be the peaks of a sunken landmass that once rose above the ocean. The Canary Islands were considered no less seriously. Researchers drew attention to their ancient inhabitants, the Guanches, who, before the arrival of Europeans, had preserved a unique culture, unusual rites, and legends about ancestors who had come from great lands that vanished in the sea. These traditions began to be linked with memories of Atlantis, with some proposing that the Guanches were perhaps the last descendants of those who survived the catastrophe. But the boldest hypothesis arose with the discovery of America. Soon after the voyage of Christopher Columbus and the opening of the New World, voices were heard claiming that Atlantis was America itself. A vast continent hidden beyond the ocean seemed a perfect candidate for the lost world. The idea was spurred not only by the scale of the land, but also by the astonishing achievements of indigenous civilizations, the Maya, the Aztecs, the Inca. Their cities, temples, roads, and astronomical knowledge stunned Europeans, and to many it seemed that so high a level of development could hardly have arisen without some link to an ancient, highly advanced civilization. These ideas found reflection in the works of philosophers, chroniclers, and geographers. On maps of the 16th century, one often sees the labels Atlantis or Insula Atlantis placed in various parts of the Atlantic Ocean, from the region of the Bermudas to the Caribbean and the coast of Brazil. Some cartographers suppose that Atlantis was a gigantic sunken continent. Others drew it as a chain of islands left after the disaster. At the same time, the first attempts emerged to explain the disappearance of Atlantis not through mythology, but by natural processes. More and more frequently, there appeared versions suggesting that the island might have gone underwater as a result of powerful earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, the slow subsidence of the Earth's crust, or gigantic tsunamis. This idea seemed especially plausible in light of real catastrophes, such as the eruption of the volcano on Santorini that destroyed the Minoan civilization, which for many became a kind of model for Atlantis' end. Yet despite the immense interest, no convincing proof of Atlantis' existence could be found. Neither in the Azores, nor in the Canaries, nor in the Americas, nor in the Caribbean did archaeologists discover ruins, artifacts, or evidence of a civilization comparable to Plato's description. Even so, the mere possibility that beyond the horizon there might be a land that could turn out to be Atlantis continued to inflame the imagination. Gradually, interest in Atlantis moved beyond strictly geographical or historical searches. It began to enter literary utopias, philosophical meditations on the fate of civilizations, and to serve as a source of inspiration for writers, travelers, and even mystics. The legend accumulated new meanings. It became not only a story of a proud people's downfall, but also a symbol of a lost golden age, an ideal society that had sunk beneath the waves yet continued to live in humanity's dreams. And yet the true explosion of interest in Atlantis, its transformation into one of the most discussed and popular riddles of its age, would occur only in the 19th century, with the rise of figures who reimagined it not merely as a philosophical myth, but as a real, material civilization whose existence, they claimed, could be proven. By the beginning of the 19th century, the legend of Atlantis ceased to be merely an episode in Plato's works and turned into an independent cultural phenomenon that sparked interest far beyond academic debate. It became a subject of discussion among writers, travelers, seekers of ancient wisdom, adherents of esotericism, and later, among early investigators who tried to rely on the achievements of science. Several factors contributed to this. First, the 19th century was an age of archaeological discoveries, when Europe began to realize that many ancient legends and myths concealed real events. It was then that Pompeii was brought to light, Troy was unearthed, and excavations began in Nineveh and Memphis. Each success seemed to confirm the idea that myths are not always inventions, but sometimes a distorted memory of actual civilizations. Second, the 19th century saw a vigorous flowering of esoteric teachings, an interest in occult knowledge, in secret societies, and in the search for a lost spiritual heritage of humankind. Within this worldview, Atlantis easily became a symbol not merely of a perished civilization, but of a vanished golden age, when people supposedly possessed knowledge and abilities long forgotten in the modern world. A key event was the publication of a book by the American writer, publicist, and politician Ignatius Donnelly. In the year 1882, his work entitled Atlantis, the Antediluvian World appeared and instantly became an international sensation. In this book, Donnelly argued that Atlantis was neither myth nor philosophical allegory, but a real, highly developed civilization, standing at the origins of all known cultures of the ancient world. He assembled a long chain of arguments comparing myths, legends, architectural traditions, and cultural features of the peoples of Europe, Africa, and the Americas. In his view, the disappearance of Atlantis was connected with a global natural catastrophe in which a vast landmass located in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean sank beneath the waves. Donnelly believed that it was the Atlanteans who spread across the world knowledge of agriculture, metallurgy, navigation, architecture, and writing. His book quickly became a source of inspiration for a wave of followers. From that moment, Atlantis ceased to be a topic confined to academic quarrels. Now everyone discussed it. Researchers, geographers, writers, mystics. A great many hypotheses about its location appeared. Some continued to search for it in the midst of the Atlantic Ocean. Others supposed it might have been South America. Still others pointed to the Caribbean, to Antarctica, or even to the Arctic. At the same time, interest in Atlantis grew within mystical and occult circles. Its image was used especially actively in the theosophical teaching of Helena Blavatsky. In her version, Atlantis was not just an island or a continent, but an entire epoch in human history, a time when a special race, the Atlanteans, ruled the earth, endowed with supernatural abilities and spiritual knowledge. In her writings, Atlantis became a projection of the golden age that perished because its inhabitants abandoned the spiritual path for the sake of power, matter, and technological might. Dozens of new versions arose from these ideas. The Atlanteans were credited with inventing flying machines, using crystals to obtain energy, controlling weather phenomena, practicing telepathy, and influencing matter by the power of thought. All this became entwined with myths, conjectures, occult teachings, and fantasies that spread with extraordinary speed. Atlantis became an integral part of the artistic culture of the 19th century. It was portrayed in adventure novels, works of science fiction, and utopias. It appeared in newspapers, popular pamphlets, and reports of geographical societies. Gradually, the image of Atlantis stepped beyond the bounds of the ancient myth and turned into a universal symbol, the symbol of a lost ideal, a vanished paradise, a riddle that humanity longs to solve. It is important to note, however, that all these hypotheses, however striking or persuasive their presentation, rested scarcely at all on real archaeology or geology. Their foundations were comparisons of myths, interpretations of legends, free analogies, and the personal conjectures of their authors. The scientific community of the 19th century, though watching this boom with interest, regarded it with obvious skepticism. Yet it was precisely in this period that a significant transition began. The first investigators appeared who decided to test the hypothesis of Atlantis not only at the level of mythology and texts, but also with the tools of science. The earliest underwater inquiries began, geological expeditions set out, and studies of the structure of the ocean floor were undertaken. Atlantis slowly started to move from the realm of philosophical and mystical reflection into the sphere of scientific search. By the beginning of the 20th century, the legend of Atlantis had finally moved out of the realm of philosophical reflection, mythology, and esotericism into a sphere where it began to be treated as a potentially real historical puzzle. In place of fantasies, mystical constructions, and unsupported hypotheses came attempts to rely on the data of archaeology, geology, and oceanography. For the first time in millennia, the myth of Atlantis became the subject of systematic scientific interest. One of the most serious and influential hypotheses of the 20th century linked Atlantis with the catastrophe that occurred on the island of Santorini in the Aegean Sea. In the middle of the century, archaeologists uncovered beneath a layer of volcanic ash a well-preserved Bronze Age city, Akrotiri. Its streets, houses, frescoes, sewer systems, and advanced infrastructure revealed a striking level of culture. Researchers concluded that a powerful volcanic eruption around 1,600 years before Christ destroyed this city and dealt a devastating blow to the Minoan civilization of Crete. This catastrophe, accompanied by giant tsunamis, earthquakes, and prolonged climatic changes, became a model compared with the destruction of Atlantis. Both the signs of high development and the suddenness of the disaster, as well as the near disappearance of an entire civilization, seem to fit. Yet the main objection to this hypothesis was geography. Santorini is not beyond the Pillars of Heracles, as Plato wrote, but within the Mediterranean. There was also a vast chronological gap. Plato asserts that Atlantis perished 9,000 years before Solon, that is, about 9,600 years before Christ, far earlier than the eruption of Santorini. Another wave of interest was sparked in the year 1968 by the discovery off the coast of Bimini, a small island in the Bahamas, of a peculiar underwater stone formation dubbed the Bimini Road. Regular, seemingly well-shaped blocks laid in a long line at first glance resembled the ruins of a wall or paved roadway. Photographs spread around the world, and claims that these were the remains of Atlantis appeared in newspapers and magazines within only a few days of the discovery. Further study, however, showed that the Bimini Road is a natural geological formation, the result of the natural bedding and erosion of the region's limestone slabs. Scientists found analogous structures elsewhere in the Caribbean, confirming its natural origin. Nevertheless, for many believers in Atlantis, Bimini long remained a symbolic proof that it might have existed. Another line of hypotheses led the search for Atlantis to entirely unexpected places, to Antarctica. This theory became especially popular in the second half of the 20th century thanks to the work of Charles Hapgood, who proposed a hypothesis of crustal displacement. According to his version, Antarctica in the distant past lay in warmer latitudes, was free of ice, and could have been home to an advanced civilization. A shift of the Earth's crust brought the continent to the pole, where it froze and became uninhabitable. These ideas gained many supporters among enthusiasts of mysteries and alternative history, but did not withstand the criticism of the scientific community. Modern data on Antarctica's geological past show that the continent has been covered by ice for at least several million years, and could not have supported a civilization akin to Plato's description. Alongside the development of the Santorini, Bimini, and Antarctica hypotheses, the 20th century witnessed a rapid advance in underwater archaeology. With the invention of scuba gear and bathyscaphs and the improvement of sonar mapping of the ocean floor, scientists gained the ability to investigate mid-ocean ridges, submarine plateaus, and continental shelves with unprecedented precision. As research progressed, it became clear that there is no hidden sunken continent in the Atlantic Ocean. All major relief structures, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, the Azores Plateau, submarine canyons, have tectonic origins and are not remnants of drowned continents. At this stage, the scientific community concluded that the hypothesis of Atlantis as a material island in the Atlantic Ocean has no solid basis. Geology and plate tectonics leave no room for the idea of a continent vanishing suddenly. Such processes take place over millions of years, not in one day and one night as Plato recounts. Even so, despite official science's skepticism, the search for Atlantis did not cease. It shifted to other regions, to the shelves off Morocco and Spain, to islands in the Caribbean, to the Black Sea, where episodes of catastrophic water level rise in antiquity have also been proposed. Hypotheses appeared that Plato might have deliberately altered the parameters of his account, multiplying numbers, changing chronology, or relocating geographic markers, in order to craft a philosophical parable about moral decline rather than to transmit a literal history. It became increasingly clear that Atlantis is not only the search for a geographic object, but also the pursuit of a universal symbol. The legend endures because it speaks to humanity's perennial fear of civilizational collapse, of the destruction that comes when a society loses balance, forfeits its moral foundation, and forgets concord with nature and the laws of justice. By the end of the 20th century, Atlantis had become an inseparable part not only of archaeological debates, but also of mass culture. It appeared in books, films, and documentaries. It became the subject of journalistic investigations and a theme of discussions in university classrooms and popular forums. The legend of Atlantis has survived millennia and continues into the 21st century, in scientific hypotheses, cultural myths, cinema, books, and endless debates. Although academic science tends to view it more as a philosophical metaphor than as a historical fact, interest in Atlantis remains lively and enduring. Modern scientific data are unequivocal. Oceanographic research, seafloor maps, and models of plate motion show that there are no sunken continents in the Atlantic Ocean. Geology leaves no possibility for the sudden disappearance of a vast island as Plato describes. None of the known mechanisms can submerge an entire continent in the span of a single day. Yet some historians and archaeologists still search for a rational kernel in Plato's tale. Among the most serious versions is the hypothesis that the myth of Atlantis reflects real catastrophes that occurred in prehistoric times. Most often in this context, scholars mention the eruption on Santorini that damaged the Minoan civilization, or the catastrophic rise in the level of the Black Sea that occurred about 8,000 years ago. There are also those who suggest that Plato himself may have deliberately altered the parameters of the story, multiplying numbers, enlarging dimensions, adjusting chronology, or shifting geographic markers. Perhaps for him, it was less a historical narrative than a philosophical parable about the fall of a civilization that had lost its moral foundations. In reality, however, interest in Atlantis has long since moved beyond science. It has become part of global cultural mythology. Its image can be found in films, literature, comics, video games, and fantasy series. Atlantis appears now as a sunken high-tech city, now as a magical world hidden beneath the sea, now as the last trace of an ancient race endowed with super-knowledge and lost technologies. From the fantastic novels of Jules Verne and Herbert Wells to contemporary blockbusters and animated films, Atlantis remains a symbol of a lost golden age, a dream of a magnificent past, of forgotten knowledge and harmony that humanity once possessed, but then lost. Today, Atlantis is at once myth, metaphor, and cultural phenomenon. For science, it remains an unsolved puzzle, a hypothesis still debated despite all geological refutations. For mass culture, it is an inexhaustible source of inspiration, a symbol of a lost ideal. And for human consciousness, it is a reminder that power, technology, and wealth will not save a society if it loses its moral bearings, its harmony, and its obedience to the laws of nature. The myth of Atlantis lives on, and perhaps precisely because it was never merely a tale of a land that vanished beneath the ocean. It has always been a story about ourselves, about how civilizations are built, flourish, err, and disappear, and about how there is always a chance to learn from that lesson